Hey, this is Derek, and you listen to Skepticality, the official audio program of Skeptic Magazine, for Tuesday, May 8th, 2012.
Skepticality. Science!
Once again, we here at Skepticality are here to bring you your bi-weekly dose of interviews and news and information for the promotion of critical thinking and science. Many of our longtime listeners might remember our friend Jeff Flagg. Well, Jeff has put together a one-day amazing event which is coming up on Saturday, May 26th in St. Louis, Missouri. It is the College of Curiosity. The goal of the event is to broaden our horizons by demonstrating the amazing things which are part of the real world we live in. Some of the folks who will be there will be mathematician Ethan Brown, the nosy astronomer Brian Dunning, and several others. You can look up more about the one-day amazing event from the link in our show notes for this episode. And while you do that, it is time for us once again to check in with our buddy Tim Farley for a dose of skepticism past and future.
I'm Tim Farley of whatstheharm.net and skeptools.com, and this is Skepticism Past and Future. This week in the past and present, we've got libel reform, and in the future we've got something called data-driven skepticism. The connection between the two is skeptic Simon Singh. Last episode, the two examples of past skeptic news coverage had something in common that I didn't mention. They both spawned lengthy libel lawsuits. This is an unfortunately common theme in skepticism. Some people and organizations do not take well to scrutiny and will take to the courts in response. It happened when Time magazine published its investigation into Scientology in 1991, when Deborah Lipstadt called David Irving a Holocaust denier in a 1993 book, and it happened again when Simon Singh referred to chiropractic treatments as bogus in his 2008 article. In a preliminary hearing on May 7, 2009, a judge ruled against Singh on the question of whether the use of the word bogus could be legally considered defamatory. Singh lost that hearing, and the case continued. Like many libel cases, it threatened to drag on for years. The Scientology case lasted from 1991 to 1996, with some appeals continuing until 2001. The Irving-Lipstadt case went from 1996 to 2000. And Simon Singh's case continued into the next year, when he appealed the preliminary ruling to a higher court. On the interesting date of April 1, 2010, he won his appeal, and 2 weeks later, the British Chiropractic Association, seeing the handwriting on the wall, dropped their suit entirely. It had lasted almost 2 years to the day from when the article had been published. The antiquated libel laws in the UK threaten free speech and stifle free inquiry for both skeptics and everyone. It even affects people in other countries through a bizarre application of the law referred to as libel tourism. Simon Singh's case has become a signature case of a libel reform movement in the UK that continues to this day. I encourage all skeptics to support this reform effort. In the future of skepticism, I'd like to talk about the idea of data-driven skepticism. This is an adaptation of something called data-driven journalism, which is a new way of creating news stories that takes advantage of increasing amounts of publicly available data and statistics by mining them for their news value. It often finds journalists teaming up with programmers and experts in data visualization to create interactive projects online that drive news stories. Prominent news organizations like the New York Times and The Guardian have gotten involved. When done well, data-driven journalism can be quite compelling, but it's not without its pitfalls. Ben Goldacre has pointed these out on his blog. He focused on how the Guardian newspaper badly misinterpreted statistics regarding prescriptions for antidepressants in England. They failed to consider alternate explanations for the numbers they reported. So what about data-driven skepticism? I think there's an opportunity for skeptics to use the same techniques as the journalists. While there aren't huge government databases that directly bear on the topics we want to research, there are certainly online data sources that can be used to make a skeptical point. And that brings me to the connection between past and future this week, which is Simon Singh. You may recall that in the fall of last year, a prominent psychic in the UK named Sally Morgan found herself in a bit of a controversy after she was accused of using an earpiece during her shows to receive cues. She denied the charges. After this occurred, Simon attended several of her shows and noted that she had stopped using the earpiece entirely. He wondered if there might not be a way to measure if that change in her show had affected her abilities. Simon noted that the website that sold tickets to Sally Morgan's shows provided a way for attendees to leave a rating, and those ratings were publicly available. And so he carefully gathered the numbers and averaged the ratings for the shows both before and after the earpiece change. Sure enough, where she received ratings well over 4 out of 5 early in the year, her average dropped to between 2 and 3 after the controversy. Now, Simon didn't make the same mistake the Guardian did. He clearly pointed out that there might be several possible explanations for this drop. But one of those explanations that can't be completely discounted is that Sally Morgan's earpiece is important to her success as a psychic. I think this is just one early example of data-driven skepticism, and I encourage skeptics to look for more. And this brings us to the end of another edition of Skepticism Past and Future. Links to additional material are in the show notes, and follow me on Twitter or Facebook under the name Krelnik, Krelnik, for a daily fact from skepticism's past and ongoing news of skepticism's future.
Thanks once again, Tim. Speaking of Tim, make sure you check out the workshop that Tim will be helping out with at this year's Amazing Meeting, the annual conference held by the James Randi Educational Foundation. Myself and Swoopy are really hoping to make it this year. We seem to get a lot of feedback about one of our more recent additions to the show, Bob Carroll. He's back again to give you another slice of information from his archives over at the Skeptics Dictionary.
This is Bob Carroll, creator of the Skeptics Dictionary and the blog Unnatural Acts. Welcome to another episode of Unnatural Virtue. In this and future episodes, I'll be offering some brief comments on topics in critical thinking, skepticism, and science. Today's topic is sympathetic magic. After psychologist Dr. Bruce Hood finished his talk at the Amazing Meeting 8 on the science of superstition, which included an amusing segment on the essentialism of collectibles, an announcement went up on the large screen that there was still time to put in an auction bid on some duct tape used by Adam Savage on one of the Mythbuster shows. Even more ironic was the fact that after his talk, several people sought Hood's autograph for their copies of his wonderful book, Supersense: Why We Believe in the Unbelievable. For those who are wondering what in the world is meant by the essentialism of collectibles, it's quite simple. It is the belief that physical objects can absorb and carry the essence of people, places, or things they come in contact with. According to Hood and many other psychologists and neurologists, belief in essentialism is a natural tendency due to the way our brains are hardwired, and it explains why otherwise rational people pay outrageous sums of money for things once owned or used by Adolf Hitler, Marilyn Monroe, or Adam Savage. What Hood calls essentialism was named sympathetic magic by James Frazer in his classic study of the function, symbols, and significance of religious myths and rituals, The Golden Bough, a study in magic and religion. Even the myths of Christianity were subjected to Frazer's scientific analysis of the cultural phenomenon we call religion. The Golden Bough was published in several volumes in the early part of the 20th century, and included, much to the delight of many readers then and now, explicit descriptions of fertility rituals aimed at getting the crops to grow. We know, of course, that raping women or sacrificing virgins won't bring rain or help the corn grow high. But our primitive ancestors saw an essential connection between similar things like men having sex with women and farmers planting seeds in Mother Earth. Our forebears also saw essential connections between things that came in contact with each other, such that the objects continued to influence each other even after they were separated. The qualities of a great warrior, for example, were believed to be somehow embedded in his sword long after he had been slain. We modern skeptics are not a whole lot different from our primitive ancestors. Our superstitions manifest themselves differently, of course. We collect autographs or carry hair clippings in our wallets. We proudly mount and frame for hanging in our living room a piece of duct tape once used by a television celebrity. We scorn superstitious people who claim they can find a missing person by holding a shirt or necklace once worn by the missing person. But we find it magical to stand in the same room that Newton once worked in, or to hold in our hands a copy of a book once owned by Charles Darwin. We laugh at the unreasonableness of astrologers, palm readers, and others who claim to see patterns in imaginary lines connecting stars, in lines of our palms, or in the entrails of animals. Yet we line up to get an autograph from James Randi or Richard Dawkins. Skeptics may find it charming that our ancestors threw spears at paintings of animals or wore antlers while dancing in pre-hunt rituals, but we generally find it unacceptably irrational to believe that a piece of bread, for example, could be transformed into a god-man for consumption and infusion of divinity. Yet most of us treasure family heirlooms as if they kept us in contact with our deceased loved ones, and we wouldn't be able to use a kitchen knife to cut our steak with if we knew a pedophile had used the knife to slice up one of his victims. Could you wear a sweater once worn by Stalin? Or would you feel special wearing one that used to belong to Einstein? Would you feel comfortable eating a piece of delicious chocolate if it were shaped like a pile of feces? Most of us, from time to time, undoubtedly slip into this primitive mode of thinking. But a bit of reflection should wake us up to the fact that, for example, oysters are not an aphrodisiac, and having a bit of good luck is not likely to influence our chances of winning the lottery that day. We may feel better after stabbing a photo of someone we're angry with, but if we're adults and our brains have matured beyond that of a 5-year-old, we know our action isn't going to hurt anyone. It may be true that rubbing an amulet given to you by your true love improves your mood, but the feelings you have, however magical they may seem, are a matter of biology, not metaphysics. Most of us know that much of our thinking and behavior is not understood by us and is due to various hormones, neurochemicals, and unconscious brain processes. The emotional and social forces that drive human beliefs may originate in biology and manifest themselves in a variety of ways in different cultures. But I see no reason to assume that knowledge and education can't continue to chip away at superstition and magical thinking. The fact that our species has flourished indicates that irrationality can't be completely detrimental to the species. And it may be true that society needs a sense of the sacred to bind it. But what a society determines to be taboo need not be so open-ended that we fail to see the difference between, say, a taboo of mutilating dead human bodies and a taboo of stomping on a piece of bread that someone believes embodies a divinity. Eliminating irrationality altogether is unrealistic, but reducing much of it, especially religious irrationality, seems a noble goal. It may be true that most of our fellow humans still think as if they were wandering on the savannah 100,000 years ago. It may even be true that the most skeptical among us once thought that nature was full of spirits and that we could make people cry by stomping on their photograph. But the fact that we were all under the spell of magical thinking when we were children should not deter us from trying to outgrow most of the superstitions that pervade our culture. And while it will do little good to act like children in the sandbox who call each other names when they disagree with each other, thinking that those who remain superstitious are unable to overcome their natural impulses and must remain as children in the sandbox forever is too condescending and too fatalistic for my taste. I suggest we get out of the sandbox and argue like adults. It is ironic, though, that the amazing meetings, supposedly celebrations of reason and critical thinking, are held in what is perhaps the one place in America where more superstitious people gather every day than anywhere else. I suppose we can hope that the rationality will someday spread its tentacles into the surrounding community of gamblers, but I wouldn't count on it. This is Bob Carroll. For more on sympathetic magic, superstition, and magical thinking, see the entries for those topics in the Skeptics Dictionary at www.skeptic.com. In the meantime, please commit some unnatural acts in public. And don't forget, skepticism, though unnatural, is a virtue.
I was just talking about the amazing meeting right before you had Bob on. Well, the amazing meeting is in Las Vegas, a town which is only there because, well, the odds must be crazy.
Hello and welcome to The Odds Must Be Crazy on Skepticality, where we share your stories, our facts and figures, and some thoughts of our own. But just some. We don't actually have that many to spare. I'm Wendy Hughes.
And I'm Jarrett Kaufman, and we'll be your guides through the mind-boggling submissions.
Hi, Jarrett. What story are we talking about on Skepticality today?
Hi, Wendy. Today's story comes to us courtesy of blog reader Bethany G. It can be found on our blog today by searching for 2 out of 30 million, also linked to in the show notes. Bethany writes,
When I went to college in California, I lived in a small residence of 50 people down the hall from a Japanese student. About 15 years later, I went to Tokyo and was walking down the platform of one of the numerous subway systems, and I literally bumped into him. We were both utterly astonished that this could happen in a city of 30 million people. I had lost touch with him until then, and actually hadn't even expected to be in Tokyo at that time, let alone bump into someone I'd lived 2 doors down the hall from for 3 years in college.
Before we break down the story, we want to point out something interesting that occurred while preparing for today's episode. When our producer, audio engineer, and cheerleader, Brian Hart, read the story we had chosen, something clicked and he sent us the following.
My skeptic brain kicked in while reading this and wondered about a city of 30 million people. I came from New York City with a population of roughly 8 million, but when I visited Tokyo in the late 1980s, I was startled at how much bigger it was than New York. But not 4 times bigger. That seemed impossible. So with the help of my close personal friend, Wikipedia, I saw the real number was about 13 million tops.
It's a good thing one of our teammates has a better sense of the population, both of New York and Tokyo, not to mention an utter lack of trust in us, to go back and fact-check our figures. 30 million, 13 million, those are both subject to the law of large numbers, besides just being staggering to the mind. Still, accuracy is something we appreciate, and we're happy to receive the correction, even if he woke us up at 4 a.m. to tell us.
This story follows one of the patterns we've begun to notice in the nearly 150 stories submitted to the blog so far. That of old acquaintances running into one another in unexpected locales. It has the additional highlight of an international coincidence and the breathtaking surprise of literally bumping into a friend in any subway station, assuming our submitter uses the word literally, let alone one half a world away from where they went to school together.
Our dear associate and resident educated person, Barbara Drescher, gave us a few of her thoughts on the matter, which we'll paraphrase here. Barbara says,
Well, it seems that the odds of this happening would be 2 in 30 million. But they really are not. Here are some monkey wrenches in that estimate.
The odds of running into someone and that person being from that residence hall are 50 times the odds of it being any specific person.
This is one of those cases where not setting a clear goal throws us off. The odds of running into a specific person are extremely low, but if you're willing to expand that to everyone in your residence, then you've suddenly heavily increased the likelihood of a hit.
The odds of someone from Japan returning to Japan after college are relatively high compared to the odds of students from other countries returning home.
This is self-explanatory, really. As well, had the 2 students run into each other in, say, Kiev, Rio, or Hong Kong, it would have been much more surprising. By one student being from the place in question originally, and a place of high return, as Barbara notes, you've nearly cemented half of the moving targets.
Normally, the odds of running into someone you knew is higher than one expects because the fact that you once knew them means that you shared some values or habits of some kind, which increases the probability that one can be found in a given location. However, in this case, the subway is an extremely common mode of travel in Tokyo, so the location is not as influential.
I have nothing to add to this, as Barbara already covered it well, but I didn't want to ruin our rhythm by keeping my mouth shut.
The odds of this event occurring at some point also rely on how long the author was in Tokyo, how active she was during that time, how active the friend was during that time, etc.
This is, of course, a perfect example of where these sorts of analyses break down when we don't have the full story, and there are a lot of details left out, naturally, that could have a notable impact on the results. Still, if she was visiting this subway station daily for several months, the occurrence is obviously far more likely than if she took the subway only one time.
Barbara goes on to point out that this story is comparable to the other stories of running into people, in which the law of large numbers dictates that any event which can occur will occur if given enough opportunities. You can even search for Barbara's own story, Not That Strange, on our site, with a puntastic K in front of not, to see her own example. These stories seem like fate, but they would really only be astonishing if we predicted them with the full details intact.
Her last point there speaks to a lot of cognitive biases and a lot of the errors we make when we evaluate a situation. Prophecies rely on the utter lack of details and the interpreter filling them in for themselves. For that matter, so do astrologers, psychics, and other people who stand to profit from our little mental shortcuts. But we also do this to ourselves regularly, cutting corners and filling in gaps to convince ourselves that something far more specific occurred than actually did. What if Bethany hadn't bumped into her Japanese neighbor at all, but someone entirely different from any other stage in her life, or in a different location, or merely saw the person across a room? The story would likely stand out just as much to her and appear just as unlikely, and yet each variation raises the chances of some event of this magnitude occurring.
Even so, we sure got a kick out of this simple, unlikely event ourselves, and imagine the same would stick with us for years. Although, hopefully the old friend we ran into now runs a Fortune 500, remembers us fondly, and just happens to have a high-ranking position open that's perfect for our skill set. Now that's a slightly more specific prediction we can wait excitedly for, even if we're not exactly holding our breaths.
Thanks for listening to The Odds Must Be Crazy on Skepticality. Please be sure to visit theoddsmustbecrazy.com and share your irreplaceable voice in the comment threads, where people will politely hit the like button to imply they read and agreed with your statement, and raising your all-important internet cred.
Also be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, circle us on Google+, and validate us in life. Hit the Submit a Story link on our site to share your own crazy stories, or tweet the short ones with the hashtag TOMBC.
The Odds Must Be Crazy is a project in collaboration with the Independent Investigations Group in Los Angeles, California. Visit them at iigwest.org. Barbara Drescher is a contributing editor to our blog and can also be found at icbseverywhere.com. Special thanks to our producer and audio engineer, Brian Hart. And until next time, remember that it's all in your head, except when it's not.
We at Skepticality have only had folks in our little home studio a couple times in the past. One of them was the guys from the American Free Thought podcast. The other was when I had my coworker Kelly Comstock here to discuss the reality surrounding home drinking water. Well, we can add one more to that list now. Our next guest, Pete Ludovice. Dr. Pete is Associate Professor in the School of Chemical Engineering at Georgia Tech. He is also a touring stand-up comedian, using his background in science as part of his act. One of our friends who regularly attends DragonCon mentioned him to me, since he often is seen there giving talks as part of the science track. He was recently up in Washington, D.C., entertaining people at the second annual USA Science and Engineering Festival. I was happy that he agreed to come to my house, sit down, relax, and talk about the current state of science communication. So last episode, I introduced a comedian, because I even told him it was the first time we actually had a comedian on the show that was a comedian. We've had people that were funny on the show before. And so this time around, I actually have somebody who's another comedian. And this person is actually a little more local. So I think you're the only second, maybe third person ever to be actually in the studio.
Oh, wow. So I'm honored.
Yeah.
Should I be honored?
Yes.
Okay.
Because, you live nearby.
Yeah, it's always easier. I mean, so we do, on my radio show, we do a lot of phone interviews and Skype interviews, but it's nicer when you're in the studio, I think.
Yeah. And, it's like...
And what a luxurious studio it is.
Oh, yes. My basement. And my dogs are upstairs. Usually they'd be here making noise.
Okay.
So let's tell people who you are.
So my name is Pete Ludovice. In addition to living close to you, I'm an associate professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering at Georgia Tech. I also work evenings as a stand-up comedian. Yeah, I think that says it all, right? Immediately now people are phoning the authorities thinking, this man should not be allowed to educate young minds.
Well, let's start with your science part first, because you introduced that first, and you're a professor at Georgia Tech? At
Georgia Tech in chemical and biomolecular engineering. And as an engineer, I guess you would call me an applied scientist, right? I mean, I was just at the USA Science and Engineering Festival this weekend doing two things. One, a night of science comedy at Georgetown University last Friday, and then I did several lectures on everything from the use of humor in the classroom to macromolecular chemistry, statistics, and the field of chemical engineering. And I always like to say that scientists worry about the fundamental laws of the universe, whereas engineers apply them and then worry about the units. And that's only because I tell a lot of jokes about unit conversions. Actually funnier than people think.
So your specialty then is chemical engineering?
So I am a chemical engineer, and right now I'm teaching plant design with a couple of my colleagues at Georgia Tech. But my specialty is polymer physics, how plastics work. And very specifically, because I had a little boo-boo in graduate school when I was a graduate student at MIT, and did blow up part of the polymer science laboratory, I do computer simulation of polymer molecules.
And now I know why.
Yes, that's exactly it. Go with your strengths, whether it's comedy or applied science. I do occasionally do some experiments with my students, but I collaborate with a number of people that do experiments. And what we do is simulate the way these funny chain-like molecules behave and try to give them some insight into why their polymeric materials behave the way they do. So
it's like that movie it's all about plastics.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, I'm working on a book about plastics in your everyday life, and everybody likes to toy with the movie The Graduate.
Yeah.
And one word, plastics, that sort of thing. And I'm trying to make it funny. I think funny is good.
So you took that movie to heart.
Yeah, indeed I did. And by that I mean plastics, not Anne Bancroft and a young man coming of age. Well, maybe I did that too. That's probably the better side of the story. But yeah.
So how did your being professor of plastic engineering?
Okay, we can live with that. Because that's how people understand it, right? I can say synthetic and biological macromolecules, but people will think Gesundheit. Plastics, that's what we do. We figure out how they work, and they're all over, your life. So how did a guy who does research and computer simulation of plastics get into comedy? Was that your question? Gosh, how does anyone do it? Everyone does it the same way, by the way. They go to an open mic.
And you get drunk?
Too. I'm trying to think, man. My first of my comments that I have to drink. I'm sure I had a couple of drinks because you're extremely nervous. Mine was at the Funny Farm Comedy Club, the now defunct one in Roswell, Georgia. That is not too far from this very studio.
No, actually, because it used to be part of Star Time.
Yeah, the Star Time Entertainment Complex. So people would come for the video games and the mini golf and stay for the stand-up comedy.
And now it's back again now because it's part of the Andretti Speed Lab.
So it moved. So Marshall Childs is the guy who ran the club, and I used to do some MC work for him, and I used to run lights and sound for him. When it closed down, he moved it to the Andretti Speed facility.
Lab?
I think it is a speed lab.
Yeah.
Where you drive the virtual cars, and it has struggled there. There's no doubt about it. But what Marshall has done is opened a very nice club in the back of the Vortex Lounge.
The Laughing Skull.
Yeah, the Laughing Skull Lounge in the back of the Vortex restaurant in Midtown Atlanta.
Okay.
And it's a very small club, But it's a great place to go see comics at because it is small. You get a very intimate experience when you do that. So,
And this is all for the listeners, even though they're all over the world. They're like, okay, so this is all about people that live in this one little tiny area in Atlanta, Georgia.
right. Absolutely. The nexus of the comedy world.
Yes,
I'm gonna
obviously.
stick with that theory. But it doesn't matter where you are. Everybody starts comedy the same way. They go to an open mic, and that's everyone from, Rodney Dangerfield to Jerry Seinfeld to David Spade. And if you watch videos of any one of those guys or any comedian you've ever seen, when they started, they were not that good, right? So I was the same way. I did my first open mic. You draw numbers to see what order you go into. And I was about to draw my number, and I thought, well, if I get too nervous, I can always skulk out the back, before they get to me. I drew number 1, so there was no escaping it. And you go up there in front of the red velvet drapes, that make it look like a New Orleans brothel. The Funny Farm and Rooster Teeth Feathers in Sunnyvale, California, both have these red velvet drapes that make you feel like some woman in a bustier is going to come out named Miss Kitty and say, pick a girl, any girl. You feel like you're actually in a brothel.
Well, do you remember what used to be at the Funny Farm during the day? Because it used to be a restaurant.
What was there?
It was at 1920s San Francisco restaurant, and then it became...
Oh, that's exactly what it looks like. It looks like a sort of a speakeasy.
And that's what it was supposed to be, as a restaurant.
Oh, no wonder.
So
there you go.
It wasn't it wasn't the comedy set. That was just part of the restaurant.
Yeah, there's a reason for everything. Yeah, I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
So now you know. It was actually supposed to look like a brothel.
Yeah. And indeed it did. And we felt like it when we were performing there. So I started there, and then you do lots of open mics all over the place. And then I started exploiting the niche of sort of science engineering comedy, and got into sort of the corporate world. And what I like to do now, what I mainly do is, well, at least the only thing that ever pays for me, any reasonable amount, is to, find a seminar or conference, everything from the American Chemical Society to the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, carpet recycling. I did a gig last year in Florida for an industry group that hauls nuclear waste for the Department of Energy. And trust me,
because that's funny.
It's a laugh riot, absolutely. There are very few people on the planet that can make a joke about the hauling of nuclear waste. I actually did. I did a musical number on it, and I'm trying to think. It was to the song, whatever, the Ode to Billy Joel. The one where the day that Billy Joel McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge, and it was about a secure container trucking accident. It was more the day that Billy Joel McAllister drove off the Tallahatchie Bridge. And what I find is the reason that niche is very good, and there are other comedians that do it, like Brian Mallow, Norm Goldblatt, and Tim Lee, with whom I just appeared at the USA Science and Engineering Festival. You go to a technical meeting, I don't care what it is. After 2, 3, 4, 5 days of technical talks, you are burnt out. And the ideal after-dinner speaker, or speaker for the social event on the third day, or speaker for the banquet, is a guy who can be funny, but put it in the context of your industry. So that's really the niche to exploit. Because, and I think of those guys I just appeared with, I'm one of the few guys that has actually been on the road in clubs. Being on the road in clubs is just very, very hard. You see all these very talented young comedians, and you don't realize how little they get paid. The headliners struggle, the features, making a so-so living, but they spend a lot of it on gas, driving in between, places. So a lot of these really brilliant people either live in their brother's basement or eventually get a TV deal. It's a very hard thing to do. So, the niche of science and engineering in the corporate or technical conference venue, I think, is what I'm trying to exploit.
Now, is some of that helped these days by things like, YouTube and podcasts and things like that?
I mean, I think it certainly does. We have an RSS feed for our radio show on WREK Atlanta, and ours is on science and technology. So literally tomorrow we'll be recording live on electric vehicles. Last week I was actually grading senior design oral reports, so we actually played a rerun. But the week before that, we had 3 scientists, including one from NASA, from the astrobiology conference that was in town in Atlanta. So we brought them over to the studio, and then we had a real-time high-definition camera telecommunications hookup with a class, high school class, right here in Atlanta, and had them asking questions about, exoplanets outside our solar system and what characteristics life would have. We learned that NASA's written many reports on this, including one that is affectionately called Weird Life, and that's how they actually refer to it at NASA. So it was really cool, it was really fun, but it was really interesting. And I think, getting that stuff out on the web helps with both, notoriety for comedy, people knowing that it's out there, and probably the main reason I do this is education. Funny humor in education.
So obviously you mentioned you have the radio station, radio show, not the station. That's part of Georgia Tech's.
Yeah, WRAK 91.1 FM. That is Georgia Tech's radio station.
And you said they have it on the web. Is it streamed to the web, or they just do the?
We can stream it on WRAK.org, but also we will do archives, with the rare exception of when the equipment malfunctions. We were talking about that before the show. And believe it or not, it is archived in the Smart Tech system, which is, let me see if I get the acronym right, at Georgia Tech, Scholarly Materials and Resources at Georgia Tech. I think that's what it is. So we have everything from technical reports to the National Institutes of Health to educational lectures like they output at MIT to this program. And it's not the only educational one we have in there. And actually, it's not the only funny one. In fact, all the faculty shows, I think, are quite funny. We have one called Sci-Fi Lab that's on science fiction, and they often do shows on the role of science fiction to science. And that is done by a number of students who interact with Lisa Yazik, who is a specialty in science fiction. And then... let's see, Charlie Bennett and Amit Doshi, two librarians at the Georgia Tech Library, do the world's first and only research library rock and roll radio show. Oh. And they do not archive that past 2 weeks because they actually play a lot of music on it, so they have copyright licensing issues. But these guys will take a topic, take a scholarly, research-oriented look at it, and play relevant music to it. I mean, it is a total hoot. In fact, I've been on Charlie's show many times. Charlie's been on my show many times as a guest host. And I guess we're trying to bring a little fun and funny back into the learning process.
And I think that helps a lot.
I'm glad you think so, because not everyone shares that view.
Wonder who that might be.
So, and I will say this, the vast majority of my academic colleagues, certainly administration at Georgia Tech, I'm going to give them a great compliment. I think they realize the value of this sort of thing, and they are very helpful in its application. And let's face it, we never say anything good about administration, whether it's the federal government administration or academic administration. There are always people that get in your way. That is not true at Georgia Tech. I work with everyone from the Center for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning to the Provost's office to the Dean's office. The Provost's office actually helped fund me going up to the USA Science and Engineering Festival and talking to young people about engineering. I was at the Georgia Tech booth, which had all sorts of cool lasers and microscopy exhibits. And believe it or not, I gave out, I'm wearing one now, I gave out, well over 1,000 plastic vinyl pocket protectors. And I think it helps in two ways. You make it a little more engaging and make people realize that scientists, engineers are not these lifeless automatons that many people think they are, and it, I guess it just takes your mind off the fact that this is just, many people consider this horribly boring stuff. So they understand the outreach. My immediate boss, the chair of the School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering, not a big fan. Not a big fan.
Yeah, it's weird to me because this hasn't changed for a long time. I mean, I look back to things like Carl Sagan,
right,
and he was denied being on the
National Academy of Sciences,
for the same reason.
Yeah, and Carl Sagan was a real top-notch scientist.
Yeah.
If he had never done any of his outreach, he probably would have been voted in the National Academy of Sciences. And there are people who interviewed later actually said that his outreach probably had a negative effect, when in fact it should have had a positive effect. Not only does he do interesting science, he tells the world about it and gets them leverage and engaged in understanding why science is important. So when they vote for, government officials, they will vote for someone who believes in the importance of fundamental and applied research. This is the best thing they could have done, and they didn't. So we're, I want to say uptight. Uptight is maybe the right word.
Yeah, and
that's changing, though, I hope.
You'd hope. I mean, I have had Randy Olson on our show.
We interviewed Randy Olson just a couple of months ago when he was in town.
Yeah, he was in town to do something at CDC. No, Emory.
Okay. Was this a couple of years ago or just a couple of months ago?
It was actually a few months ago. We had him on our show about 3 or 4 times. Okay.
I tried to get him when he was coming to Emory a few years ago, but then he got the call from the Tribeca Film Festival for what is it? Flock of Dodos. This was back when Flock of Dodos was out.
Yeah, that's the first time we had him on.
So you're right. Now he was at Georgia Tech screening Sizzle, a global warming comedy.
Yeah.
And he gave a lecture, and I had him in. And what Randy said, and I've seen his movies, and I think the world of him. What he said on our program is that scientists and engineers, we're story phobic.
Yeah.
That we're like, well, we don't need a story to tell this. And you're right, you don't need a story, so you can compact it in this scientific journal that only scientists read. But when you want to explain it to someone, you need to put it in context. And a story is probably the best way that people can relate to information. It actually, not only calms you down and makes you want to listen, I think it actually helps you cognitively remember the material. He understands that, a lot of people don't. And the best example I ever have was interviewing a scientist from New York named Doug Glick. And Doug Glick wrote an article on the comedy of Eddie Izzard.
That's how I know the name. I think I read this.
Oh, okay. And I think he would point out that it's pronounced Eddie Izzard. So I'll say Eddie Izzard. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. And he wrote this thing, and the guy who sent it to me was not a scholar saying, well, you should look at this article. Actually, my scholar friends send me articles that actually have swear words in them because they're fascinated that somebody would publish something in the literature with a swear word in it. So a comedian sent this to me. He said, Pete, the game's over. We figured out Eddie Izzard's humor. Just read this article. It was utterly unintelligible. And I have a PhD. So, and I asked him about it, and I said, you introduced this term called a chronotope, which refers to variations in time references in the humor, which is something Eddie does, and he does it very well.
Yeah.
And that was the essence of the joke. And I said, must we understand chronotopes to pursue a critical analysis? He goes, no. And then he sort of explained it in a very good way, and he's a really cool dude, and he uses humor in his classroom, so it was a great interview. And what he does is really neat. But I think it was a bit of an illustration of the fact that maybe we write it in a little long-haired, with a little obfuscation in the journals to make it sound more impressive than it is.
I don't think any of this is ever on purpose because I come from the computer programming world and computer engineering, and we do the same thing. Until you go out and talk to people who have no idea about it, you don't realize. And at work, I work for an engineering company, and so when I first got to my job, I was like the only programmer in there. And I learned quickly that, what I'm talking about, they have no idea about, and I didn't even think about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably the same thing.
Yeah, it is. I don't think it's malicious. I think you're absolutely right. And then we start trying to explain it to people, and we realize how poorly we do this. And that's myself included. We did a series of shows where we had some guests cancel at the last minute. So one show, we took the Flame Challenge. And this is a challenge put out by Alan Alda, who helps fund this, the Center for the Communication of Science?
Yeah, it's for kids. They have the kids challenge, the Flame Challenge.
And basically what you're saying is explain to an 11-year-old how a flame works. And probably a middle school science teacher is going to do a much better job because all us crazy academics immediately we realize how complicated a flame is. I mean, a flame is a steady state, non-equilibrium, transient plasma evolution. We start using these words and we're just doomed. And we did it live on the air. I think we failed miserably. It was not good. And I think admitting that and being willing to, it's what people refer to as lower yourself when they talked about Carl Sagan to some degree. It's not lowering yourself. If we use humor and other vehicles to inform people about important financial issues, important safety issues, right? The CDC did this a while ago with that zombie preparedness kit.
Yeah, we had them on.
Yeah, and they think, well, what are you people just wasting the taxpayers' money? He said, no, look what happened. We put this out here. And basically the zombie preparedness kit is the same as the tornado, the hurricane, the flood preparedness kit.
It is.
It went viral, and we communicated with just a little effort, more information than we ever could. A good example I did was, I told a few examples of this joke when I was at the USA Science and Engineering Festival. And so I'm a comedian. So comedians sell CDs and T-shirts. And one of the T-shirts I sell has "Nerds Kick Ass" in the elements of the periodic table. And sometimes I'll make a joke about it. And if I'm talking about the periodic table, I said, I've got this T-shirt. It's very educational. You not only learn about the elements of the periodic table, you learn about its history, because this shirt is 142 years in the making. 142 years passed since Dmitri Mendeleev first wrote down the periodic table to the naming in 2011 of Darmstadium, the 110th element, which is the DS in nerds. And believe it or not, I was looking for years to do a shirt like this, and I wanted to do something like Nerds Kick Ass or something reasonable. And I tell the audience, and the audience had middle school and high school kids in it, I said, until this, the only really cool thing you could put on a T-shirt with the periodic table of the elements were swear words. And I know what you're thinking, parents, how could you say that to these people? I said, but think about it. I now have an entire generation of young people thinking about the periodic table. My work is done. And people do criticize me. They say, well, why do you do these cheap, sophomoric bathroom humor, potty mouth jokes with middle school kids? And I said, and they claim you'll never engage a middle school kid or a high school. And you see, you're laughing because you've met middle school and high school kids.
I was one at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And we're PG-ish. I mean, we don't swear or anything when we do these things, but the movie Superbad is not that far off from these kids. So, yeah, I mean, they almost immediately shut down if you're this bland, lecture-type guy. And I give a lot of lectures, and I remind people that academic lectures are like Mexican food, right? It's really just the same ingredients. We just have 10,000 slides that are left out. We just arrange them in a different way. Like Mexican food's the same ingredients. It's just arranged differently. And when you're done, much like Mexican food, you feel bloated and regret having too much tequila and refried beans. So, so that's what we do. We're about infotainment and trying to reach everyone from adults to young kids.
Yeah, and I just... It never ceases to amaze me that more top scientists don't realize that one of the reasons why we have such a problem in the United States with scientific knowledge is because they aren't communicating correctly and they don't think about it. And when somebody wants to change it, they get mad.
Yeah, and maybe Randy Olson comment on that. He said he gets death threats.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, we're trying to find the right level, and Randy Olson's doing his thing, and maybe parts of his movies are too highbrow, too lowbrow, but he's out there trying it. But he says people get angry and send him threatening emails and letters because they believe they're dumbing it down. And I don't think that's true. I think you can encapsulate and summarize and explain only the main salient points without dumbing it down. But let's be honest, you have to dumb it down for almost everyone, and that includes me. So, for example, in polymer chemistry, polymer science, molecular modeling of polymers, I can read anything and talk intelligently on that. But when I go see my physician has to simplify it to the point that a reasonably intelligent, educated person can understand it. And, we get into it all the time. My physician is actually a big believer in humor. I was just in there because he put me on statins to control blood fats, cholesterol. Yeah. And, of course, he says, well, let's try it for 3 months, and we'll look at your liver function, right? Which any reasonable, doctor would do, because you always look at liver function. You put in a high concentration of any drug, your liver, its job is to filter that stuff out as a big sort of chemical filter.
Yeah, it's basically, being a hardcore drinker.
Yeah, exactly, right. It tries to get the artificial stuff out of it. So I did the experiment, but in the meantime, I read all the studies on blood sugar management problems with these things, and I read the things on short-term memory loss, and I came in, I said, look, And by the way, my blood fats went through the basement. It's absolutely perfect.
Yeah. Oh, those drugs are really good. I'm on one.
Yeah,
myself.
and he takes one, and a lot of doctors believe they're just miracle drugs. And I said, well, what about these things? He said, look, let's look at the relative risk of heart disease versus these other things. Now, if you were on the maximum dose, which I believe is 80 milligrams per day, and I know friends that are on that, and one of my friends is pre-diabetic because of that. Well, potentially because of that. We don't really know. He put me on the 10 milligram dose, and he said, look, it's so good, you can take it every other day. So I am willing to balance half the lowest dose of that against these other things and give it another 6 months and see how things work there. But he explains it in a reasonable fashion like that. In fact, he's so good. He likes jokes. And there's actually a joke I tell about him. There's many jokes I tell about him because I saw him the other day, and I walked up to him and said hello, and I said, I've got to say, because my wife goes to the same doctor, I said, I've got to say hello to the only other guy who gets to see my wife naked on a regular basis. He looks me square in the eye, and he goes, that you know of. Yeah, that's the kind of doctor he is. So, and this is something you notice. So I just turned 50, but probably when I started to be 40, your doctor asks you different questions, right? He doesn't ask you, are you feeling okay? I kid you not. One of the first questions he always asked me, he said, are you having any trouble getting an erection? And I always answer the same thing. I said, no, I'm having trouble finding the time and energy to put it to good use. And finally, after about 10 years, he goes, do you know why I ask you that question? I said, because you're creepy? He said, no.
Blood pressure.
Well, okay, so it could be that. But it's a lot of things. He actually uses it to diagnose brain tumors, which made me think he didn't listen to medical school at all. But if you get a brain tumor near or on your pituitary gland, or probably hypothalamus too, any one of these master endocrine regulating glands, your sex drive goes down. And you are right. Sex drive can go down for a variety of reasons. So he was being very smart about that. I thought he was creepy. Well, I still think he's creepy, but and that's the thing. So he explained that to me. So that's what I'm saying. There's nothing wrong with simplifying things and leaving out all the nitty-gritty details to explain it to someone like that. And so they're wrong. That doesn't mean that the scientists aren't going to pursue all the details and all their glory. It just means you have to simplify it a bit to get all these people that I secretly believe are closeted skeptics and science fans that just don't really talk about it. I believe there's a little old lady in Macon, Georgia, that is a science fan, and she's skeptical about some of these crazy claims of various organizations, and she feels isolated, right? Because other people are like, well,
I'm sure
that crazy Skepticality show, we don't trust those guys. But if she knew that there were more folks out there like her, it would be different.
I get at least 2 or 3 emails a week from people who find our show, even though we've been around for 7 years now. And they say the same thing. Yeah. It's like, I never knew there were people out here talking about this stuff until my friend Billy knew this guy who told me about this, and I looked it up. So, yeah, it's definitely true. And what gets me is, where do you think the mindset comes from with all these top-ranked, quote-unquote, scientists who don't like the fact that you're trying to educate people?
Okay, I'm going to say it's the same mindset that a lot of people have. It's job security. That's really what it is.
Don't they remember how much schooling they had to have?
Well, yeah, I think that's it. So, for example, I had an electrical engineering professor when I was an undergraduate at the University of Illinois who said, protective language is in every field. Now, we were doing basic circuit analysis, so he was giving us the language of that. Everyone has some protective language. Some language is good because you have to shorthand things, right? So, IT and computers, tons of acronyms. You have to use it, right? Otherwise, you can't communicate. But you can expand out those acronyms and simplify what they mean for, other folks. I pick on the microelectronics industry because they use CD. CD means critical dimension. I'm like, you can't say critical dimension. And so some of it is a little protective, and I've had other professors tell me that there's as many new words in a first-year chemistry class as there are almost in a first-year language class. Yeah. And that's probably not an unreasonable estimate at all. But I think it's job security. For example, as an academic, no one wants to admit that the nature of higher education is changing dramatically. Our jobs aren't going to be the way they are in the next few years. There may be less of us. We may be doing different things. I would say we'd be making less money, but given the strain we have on places like Georgia Tech and other universities, we haven't seen raises in years.
Yeah.
We've had furlough days. And I'll be honest with you, Georgia Tech is actually doing better than a lot of universities. And even we've had, issues and things like that.
Yeah, I noticed that Georgia Tech got a quite steady climb after they poached the MIT's old dean, now works for Georgia Tech. About 5 or 6 years ago.
Is this dean of engineering?
Yeah, no, I guess the dean of the entire school.
Okay,
I forget the guy's name, but he was the guy in charge of MIT, and Georgia Tech poached him about 5
Yeah,
or
we
6
have a lot
years
of guys
ago.
from MIT. In fact, there's a lot of guys that go back and forth. And Caltech and University of Texas and places like that will poach various folks.
But this guy was actually, I guess the controversy at the beginning was the fact that he wanted to leave MIT because he wanted to do things more modern. And that...
could this be the Dean of Computer Science, Rich DeMillo?
Could be. I forget the guy's name completely, but yeah.
And Rich, for example, is now in charge of the C21U, the 21st Century University there, and that really is exploring how things are changing. And it's very insecure for a professor like me to say, well, your job may not be, it may be totally different. It may not exist in 10 years. But that's just the way it is. Accept it and say, look, I've got some skills. I can adapt to some region in there. But I think that's all it is. I think it is just job insecurity. And I think what we do is, and I've interviewed many science writers. In fact, we interviewed the head of MIT science writing program. We interviewed, Mr. Mooney, who wrote The Republican War on Science. Chris Mooney.
Chris Mooney.
Yeah. And actually, this guy... Brian Mallow, a science comedian that Tim Norman and I work with. Brian is a science writer. He's not a scientist. But his insights on science and the way it interacts with society are really amazing. So I think it takes all kinds. And we're all just protective. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the local golf pro at the country club and suddenly, the middle-aged housewives are looking at the tennis pro and you're like, hey, that's my turn. You're just all... So, I think they're a little uptight. I think that is changing, but I think we've still got maybe 1.5 more generations of people to sort of retire before we get out of that.
Well, people say it all the time, and it's like a old hat saying, but it's very true. The whole thing about the buggy whip is that, and if you don't figure out how to transition from the buggy whip to the car...
Yes, that's exactly it.
You're going to die.
And we're in transition, and what I would say to parents is, if you're looking at college, or students, if you're looking at college, look at colleges that have these interesting new programs. They have all sorts of funny names, living learning communities. I teach a living learning community at Georgia Tech on humor, but also its application to improve technical innovation, communication, and education. And it's a struggle. It's a struggle to work with the students on that sort of thing. But we have these very hands-on, open-ended projects. In mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech, they have their own lab where they can build their own projects. They can build their own project and enter it in the Inventure competition, which has a first prize of $15,000 plus a good $15,000 to $25,000 in free legal help to patent your invention, which is a very valuable thing. And folks like Ray Vito in the Provost's office and Craig Forrest in mechanical engineering have been doing that. Craig actually, I think, was the runner-up. He was certainly a finalist in American Inventors.
Okay.
And he did his graduate work at MIT. I was very fascinated by that whole, that mechanical engineering course they have there, which we have at Georgia Tech too, where you build a robot that battles it with other robots.
Oh yeah. The robot battle type.
Yeah, I forget the name of the course at MIT, but they televise it there. We usually podcast it here. We televise our Inventure program. So these are the kinds of new things that people should be doing, because let's face it, you learn, whether it's programming or engineering or science, you don't learn it by just sitting in a classroom and writing down formulas. You learn it by getting a task and going out there and doing it. You can do it in anything. I've got a friend, Larry Bonham, who's also a very funny guy. Larry teaches a course on analytical chemistry. And, so they use, all sorts of, infrared spectroscopy, UV visible spectroscopy, all sorts of techniques to measure the amount of chemicals. for his sort of final project a few years back when we were worried about all the lead paint coming in on consumer products from China. He just took a bunch of little products, like toy cars and things like that, gave them to the students and said, tell me how much lead is in that stuff. And that was a real practical thing where they had to think about the procedure and how they would apply it and things like that. That's how you learn. And ironically, that's not new. That's the internship method. That's thousands of years old, right? The apprentice. It's the apprentice method where the blacksmith taught the young guy that way as well.
You can have this horse if you put shoes on it.
Yeah, exactly. So that combined with just not being so uptight. And the reason a little humor, the reason a little lack of uptightness is good is because failure is an option, right? You learn more from your failures than you do from your mistakes. And if we're just, here's the assignment, I'm going to grade you on it. Here's another assignment, I'm going to grade you on it. There's not enough room for failure. So the open-ended thing is, here's an interesting design. It didn't work all that well. But why was the design potentially good in the first place, and what failed in it? That's what a good part of your grade should be based on. But the experience of taking a venture, whether it's a single project in class or literally a company. So my minor at MIT was entrepreneurship. And I wrote the business plan for basically Apple's HyperCard.
Oh, okay.
It was this presentation thing.
I was a kid. I remember those things.
And then there was a version that a company that Adobe bought had for presentation and quizzing. And now we have all sorts of different versions of that, and that's what it was. And I think the margin on those particular companies is kind of razor thin, so I'm kind of glad I didn't pursue that. But yeah, that's the whole thing. This open-ended experience is something that is very, very important in colleges today.
So we haven't talked about very much things that were funny.
Yeah, and it's funny. You said you went to UNLV?
Yes.
So UNLV... I only did one show in Vegas. I mean, this is embarrassing, right? I go into Vegas. I did a show at the FDA lab right on the edge of campus of UNLV.
Yeah, I know what that is.
So I did a funny show about chemistry for those guys, and then I drove to Phoenix the next day, and I never went gambling or drinking or anything. I went running the next morning, but that was about it. So
I grew up in Vegas. I went back for college. I don't drink. I haven't really drank.
So
ever.
You're like the natives that I hang out there. They're like, there's the Strip, and then, we live over here and do our stuff.
Even though I lived like right off the Strip, but
well, yeah, it's within walking distance from the campus.
I just never. I mean, I went there back in the day when the buffets were cheap and great.
Yeah.
Now they're all great and expensive.
Okay.
But
so this was the buffet and the complimentary watered down drinks that people lived on. Yeah.
If we wanted to, when I was in college, if we wanted to go to to drink and have good food, you had like the $4.99 all you can eat buffet, and then you play craps because you can actually use a system like hardly ever lose money ever. Mm-hmm. And if you're sitting at a table, you get free drinks.
Yeah.
So in college, it's the best ever. You can get like really free drinks and cheap food.
But see, that's the thing. I think Vegas doesn't like college students or nerds. Because the American Institute of Chemical Engineers went to Reno a few years back, and I don't think we're ever going to be asked back again because we didn't gamble enough. I mean, that's where they make their revenue. And in fact, not only did we not gamble, you would have control theory engineers, sidle up to the retiree who's losing their entire retirement income in the video poker and say, do you want me to explain the odds there for you? Because this is not a good investment for you. And then that's why they're never having us back again.
Yeah, if you go to a mainstream hotel casino in Vegas, they don't care because there's so many people it doesn't matter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Reno's a
little smaller, so maybe that's it.
Yeah, it's like, they struggle a little bit more there, and they're a little more old school Vegas. Yeah, in Reno.
Yeah.
So, great. So, where can people see you?
Well, yeah, they can find out where to see me at Dr. Pete Comedy. That's drcomedy.com. And it'll have upcoming events here. Like I said, I was just back from the USA Science and Engineering Festival. This Thursday, I will be appearing at the awards banquet for the American Chemical Society in lovely Midland, Michigan. So it's not like I go to Vegas a lot. And upcoming performances at the Exit Theater in San Francisco, the Basement Theater in Atlanta, and the Chicago Fringe Festival for my one-man show, Feel the Power of the Dork Side.
Let's see.
Which is actually, it's sort of a funny look at science and scientists And ironically, that started because we did a summer biostatistics program with Emory University, funded by the National Institutes of Health. And I asked the head of the biostatistics program at Emory, could we take a little chunk and try it with humor and see if it makes a difference? So we did it with humor. We took analysis of variance, and the chairman of the department, he attended. He walked up to me afterwards. That was really great. Let's see what the students thought of it. The students were flabbergasted. They were appalled because we got the idea from the fact that safe driver classes are taught in the states of Texas, Florida, and California by stand-up comedians. You can look this up on the web. And what's funny is I was doing a show for the American Institute of Chemical Engineers in Houston, Texas, and it was sort of a fundraiser for the local chapter. And I said, well, let me call up the local comedy club, the Laugh Stop, which is a funny comedy club in Houston. And usually we can get it for free on a Monday or Sunday, and they'll keep the food and drink, and we can keep the door. And they said, oh, no, we're busy. I said, what are you busy on a Monday night? They said, well, we're doing driver education classes. And it turns out they make more money from driver education classes. So I thought... Yeah,
because, you get people laughing about driver education as they're getting drunk at the bar.
Yeah, and you have to do it to get the points off your license. So there's a big incentive to do it. And anyone can teach it as long as they teach the appropriate material. It doesn't say you can't put jokes in there. So what was interesting is I thought, well, if you can teach boring stuff like driver safety with humor, you got to be able to use that for statistics. But we made a mistake. All the people in the summer program at Emory University wanted to get a PhD in biostatistics. So to them it was a distraction. Yeah. But to regular people, statistics, that's a very difficult concept. It's theoretical, it's very confusing. So I made up a show on statistics for regular people, performed it at the New Orleans Fringe Festival, where the NOLA defender said it was, part stand-up, part statistics, part song, and all incredibly smart. They really liked it. And now I'm doing a more general version of it that's statistics and evolution and polymer science, and it's just a funny look at things. And you'll actually learn something as well. So hopefully, no one will recommend that I be institutionalized as a result of that.
And that's the same idea. It's the same. People don't realize. Yeah. One in what are we now at? Like 8 billion people. There's a 1 in 8 billion event happens a second.
Yes, exactly. So we still do some statistics calculations and show you how they're used. But if I can get one thing across to people, and that is that anytime anyone reports anything, if there's no error bar on it, immediately be at least a little suspicious, right? Without an error bar, you can't tell anything. And probably the best example is the recent BP oil spill. So I've been reading the 300-plus page report on that because my friend Arnie Stenzel, who's actually involved in a lot of that, gave a lecture recently at Georgia Tech, and said that a big part of the reason that happened is because they had put a cement plug over that well before they were getting ready to, get it in a regular processing stage. And the first thing they do is they put that cement plug on, and then they pump out the literally thousands of pounds per square inch of pressure of mud and water and sand on top of it. And as they pump that out, they look to see if the pressure raises above it. And if the pressure goes up, it means it's leaking something, oil, or even worse yet, and more dangerous, gas. And they had 3 different sensors, 3 different measurements. 2 of the 3 said the pressure was increasing and they should be concerned. 1 said no. You don't need to know anything about statistics to know that 2 out of 3 odds that it's leaking gas that may come to the surface and cause a big fire and explosion are bad odds, right? You don't need to know about students' T distribution and Fisher's theoretical work in statistics to understand that. So a lot of it is that very basic sort of thing. So even something like the BP oil disaster, you can understand these sorts of things. And then we throw in some cheesy jokes in between, and hopefully the net result is good.
It's kind of like the whole study they did where they realized that the last space shuttle disaster that happened is because somebody made a bad PowerPoint.
Ooh, how did that happen?
They formatted the thing wrong, and people that read it, they took it as gospel, and then they made some mistakes.
Okay, and that happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when we write, I'm working on my final now. I'm just about to finish the final exam, and you write it a little bit incorrectly, and you make a different assumption. Well, then what happens is a student argues for partial credit because they had a completely reasonable interpretation of the question. But if that has to do with the resistance to a piece of high-speed foam hitting your wing on the space shuttle, there are much bigger consequences.
Oh, yeah. You'd hope.
Yeah. The favorite example, and I do talk about this, is we crashed a $180 million Mars probe into the surface of that planet many, many years ago because of a metric to English unit conversion.
Oh, yeah, that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah. No, but it's well over 10 years. I keep telling that, but I know it's more over 10 years. And I make the point that the average, person out there that's not a scientist doesn't care about unit conversion errors. They think a unit conversion error is a botched sex change operation. And to be honest, and this is true, and I'm not the only one that's made this observation, but I do a whole funny bit on this. The only group that we have really converted to the metric system are drug dealers. Right? They're very good at it.
Yeah, I didn't think about it. You're right.
Yeah, and I do a funny bit about the Disney Imagineers and Carlos the drug dealer trying to teach the metric system. So, yeah, hopefully a little humor actually makes statistics palatable. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, it sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah.
So great. So thank you so much for coming in our basement studio.
Lovely studio.
Yeah.
It was my pleasure.
Yes. Great. Dr. P will be at DragonCon once again this year. Hopefully, he'll do one of his funny science geek-themed comedy shows for us there at the Skeptics track. As usual, the things you just heard here on this episode will be in the show notes at our website, skepticality.com.
Hungry for more skepticism? Want to learn the truth about the scientific controversies of our time? Then subscribe to Skeptic, the quarterly magazine Stephen Jay Gould called the best journal in the field. To subscribe, visit skeptic.com today.